Welcome to today's session, a full intro to Azure Devops projects in 60 minutes or less, which, according to our schedule, should be done in 45 minutes. Feel free to use the hashtag Scottish Summit 2021 during this session, preferably about things that interest you during this session. Before we get started, we'd like to thank the sponsors for today's event, including ScriptRunner, DQ Global, Proximo 3, Redspire, Agilysys, and Hitachi Solutions.
So for the next 45 minutes, we'll be doing a full intro into Azure DevOps projects, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we will be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including source control, the boards, the pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And we will be showing how these services look during the session. And at the end of the session, you will have a basic understanding of how Azure DevOps works and how it can be used for your data platform deployments.
To give this session some context, one of us is from the SQL development team, and the other from the SQL operations team. In reality, most of the topics covered in this session can apply to all kinds of teams, with most being generic to Azure DevOps. Anyway, our managers decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family. Therefore, we must present this introduction to the team.
In reality, getting yourself and your team up to speed on these services is a gradual process. However, since this is only a 45-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process with this introduction. And in addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must beat the stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for the priority of those items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And a Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments if they appear.
Hey, Sander, before we go any further, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes, shall we? So I'm Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA living in the Netherlands. I'm a Cloud and Data Center MVP. I work for Waypoint Analytical, and I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. You can, if you have any questions after this session, feel free to send me an email. I'm also on Twitter. And before I get this question, all the demos you'll see today will be on my GitHub page. Go to the presentations repository, find this session, and you will have the demos right there. You can use them, change them, and reteach them. Do whatever you want to do with them. And now Kevin has a slightly more complicated bio than me because, yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks for that, Sander. And on that note, my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a senior database architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you might be able to tell from the accent, I'm originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why Sander says this is complicated. Now, I have over 24 years experience working in IT, and over that time, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil and health insurance industries. In fact, I've supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. Now, I also have various certifications, including both the Ode and the New Style MCSE, And more recently, I became a Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert, which is fairly relevant for today's session. In addition to that, I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and recently I've become a Microsoft Certified Trainer as well. Just like Sander, you can also find me on social media in various places. For example, here I'm on Twitter, I'm also on LinkedIn with a user-friendly URL, and I have my own blog. So, Sander, before we talk about projects, we want to discuss its differences between Azure DevOps Cloud Services and Azure DevOps Server. For those who aren't aware, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application that you install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. However, it's now been rebranded to look and feel exactly like Azure DevOps Cloud Services, so it's easy to move between the two. Personally, I'd prefer to use Azure DevOps Server so that we can handle security better on premises. Plus, it means we get to keep the backend databases so we can do all the additional reporting that we just can't do yet in Azure DevOps Cloud Services. However, Sander, the downside is that if we do that, we'd have to deploy one or more servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons, and maybe some other servers as well. In addition to that, we'd have to patch and maintain all those servers that we deploy.
However, if we decide to use Azure DevOps Service in the cloud instead, we have to do those kind of things. So you don't have to patch and maintain anything because it's all done in the background for us by Microsoft. Plus, it's easier to install the extensions from the marketplace.
That's true, and we can still secure it in Azure anyway. Besides, whichever we use, we must consider security and compliance to keep our auditors happy. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
But the main point we want you to take away from this section is that you can install Azure DevOps Server, so you have to patch and maintain everything on those servers. Whereas with the cloud-based version, it's all done behind the scenes for you.
And since we're talking about the structure, we will go in now and have a quick look. So, as you can see, our Azure DevOps has its own structure. At the top has a logo which represents your account. And on the left-hand side, you can see that you have access to one or more organizations. Now, these organizations can be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, they can be just a division within that enterprise, or, like as you can see here, it can be organizations that you've created yourself for testing purposes. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can actually change some settings at the organization level. So as you can see here, for example, we can do a few things in the general section, including some overview of stuff like changing the name of the whole organization. But if you do that, please be aware that will change every URL that references that organization. So if you share it with anybody, make sure they're aware you're going to do that. Also, a few other interesting settings in the overview section, such as auditing and viewing the usage. You can see what extensions you currently have installed in your organization as well. And you can also find your organization in with Azure Active Directory, which is a fairly important thing to do if you want to tie it in with source control and various things like Azure Synapse Analytics. Now in the security section, there's a couple of interesting things that you can do here. For example, we can set permissions for various groups and users at the organization level. And this can be quite useful if you want to do things, for example, like prevent certain people from installing certain extensions. I will highlight something in the board setting here currently. You can change or modify processes. We will talk about this later on in the session though when we discuss Azure Boards. There's a few pipeline settings that we can change, and we'll talk more about pipelines later on. In the repository section, you can change the default branch name for new repositories. As some of you are probably aware, there's a little bit of controversy surrounding the origins of the master naming convention used within Git. With this in mind, Microsoft have now introduced the ability to do this. GitHub have also followed suit, and from now on, all their default branches are called main. And in addition to that, you can also do this in Git for Windows from now on when you go to install. And finally, you can view your artifact settings. So if we now go back to the home of this particular organization, you can also see that each organization has one or more projects. And if I click on this one, for example, you can see all the features that Sander mentioned at the start of the session on the left-hand side here. And just like with organization settings, if you have the right permissions, you can change some various settings at the project level as well, including again the ability to change the name and to add a nice picture to represent your project. You can also manage your teams in here. So for example, if I click on the default team, I can now remove people. I can fine-tune permissions within the project for either a team or a logical group that you create for separation of duties, or for users themselves. Please try and refrain from using users out. I would suggest keep sticking to keeping your permissions to groups and teams. So if I click on the default team, for example, you can see some of the permissions we can fine tune. Now we've got some other interesting settings here we can do. For example, we've got some settings relating to the boards as well for project and team configuration. Also various pipeline settings again, including agent pools, which we'll cover later on. Again, you've got some interesting settings to do with repositories. From here, you get an overview of all your repositories in your project. And again, you can change the default branch name in case you don't have the permissions to do it at the organization level. You can also set some really interesting policies here. I think out of all of these, to be honest with you, there may be a file path validation might be useful, but for the rest of them, I suggest keeping them off unless you've got a really good business case. And then finally, you can see how much storage your artifacts are using for your project, and of course some settings relating to your tests.
Now we're talking. Remember, there are other things you can configure as well if you dive even deeper into these settings. So the main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured. Anyway, now we've covered the project settings. Let's cover our version control options with Azure Repos, which is a feature in Azure DevOps.
Oh, you mean like SourceSafe?
Well, maybe something a little bit more modern, since Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems. We can use something called Git.
But that would only be for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Oh, actually, I think if you start using it for your ops stuff as well, for your scripting and your processes, maybe even documentation, and they start using it and putting everything in version control, they will start to perform better. At my company, we've decided to put all those scripts and all that documentation into source control, and this is all shared throughout the IT department in a very easy and efficient way.
Well, I'm always game for efficiency, Sander, so tell me more.
Well, like I said, Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems. It supports TFVC and Git. But because we want to have something like a distributed version control system, we would have to choose for Git. And in fact, if you go into the Azure repos right now, Kevin, you can show how it looks like based on a SQL Server project.
Okay. Well, I'll go into Azure repos and select files. And just like Sander said, this is actually just a graphical representation of how it look if you run it through your command line effectively. Okay, and there's other things down there you can do, like you can do on your normal Git client. You can view the commits, pushes, and your branches as well, which you will return to, no doubt, at some stage. Tags and any outstanding pull requests, which can be fairly important if you're working on a team that does a lot of work with branches. On that note, what about branching strategies, Sander? Because I've heard they're pretty important.
Yeah, and they are. You have to have some kind of branching, um, yeah, some kind of flow. So there's various ones that we can use. So the most common ones are the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the main difference between those two? Because they sound fairly similar to me.
Yeah, and they are. But the major difference is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch unless it's a hot fix. And with the GitHub workflow, there's no development branch. So all there is are just feature branches, and when they get tested successfully, they get merged into the main branch right away. And us devs have been using source control for many years now. So if we do something like pair programming, they can probably get used to it pretty fast.
Peer programming?
No, pair programming. This is where two people write code together, and you would normally do this sitting next to each other. And I know with all the COVID stuff, this is probably going to be a challenge, but research has shown it takes a bit longer to do, get the same result, but you end up with more stable code, and people learn new coding practices easier and faster.
Wouldn't that mean there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice?
Now, like I said, it takes a little more time to do. There's about a 15% overhead involved, and that overhead is compensated by the increased quality of code, which means less bug fixes. And we all know that bug fixes in later stages in the development uh, cost a lot of money. And of course, there are other methods that we can use, like code reviews and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, we just have to test it out and figure out what works best for us.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
That's important. It looks like Azure Repos has branching policies that we can use. And one of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch.
Well, that sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we have to deal with financial data. So, on that note, let's have a look and see if we can do it. So, I'm going to go into the branches section in Azure Repos, select the ellipsis at the end, and look at branch policies. Now, to be SOX compliant, you have to have the following principle in place. And to do that in the branch policy in Azure Repos, you would select minimum number of reviewers to be 2. And the other recommended practice is to automatically include reviewers. So for example, here I can add Sander as an automatic reviewer. So every time there's a pull request, he would get an email that asking to review it. I'll just set this back off now for the benefit of this session.
Okay. And these are the main points we want you to take away from this section about Azure Repos. Azure Repos supports multiple version control systems. However, Git has become the facto standard nowadays. And in addition, you can secure your updates using branching policies, like you've seen Kevin just demonstrate a couple of seconds ago. And Git also hooks really nicely with other tools from Microsoft, like Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I will just see actually, because I do believe I can do a demo of this for everybody now. So this is Azure Data Studio, and for those who aren't aware, it's a Microsoft application you can use to manage database related services, which is constantly evolving. For example, at the moment it can support things like SQL Server and Azure PostgreSQL. It's multi-platform and contains some useful ways to deploy various Microsoft Data Platform solutions. So if I click down here, for example, and click on Deploy as Server, and I will actually zoom. I do apologize everybody for this. So let's just zoom out. I usually tend to zoom in. So as you can see here, I can deploy to numerous SQL Server related services, as well as Azure Arc Data Controller as well. And as you can see, Postgres hyperscale server groups as well. So anyway, we better discuss Azure Boards, Sander, since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items. Now, Azure Boards can use basic Agile Scrum or CMMI templates for each project that you create in Azure DevOps. As I mentioned earlier, these templates are also called a process. So if you remember, I showed it in the organization settings earlier where you can change them. Because we're using Scrum Sander, we'll probably want to use the Scrum process. For now, we can keep this process as standard, but we can customize it if we need to by doing things like adding, removing columns and adding various other objects into it.
Aren't you going to demo that?
Okay. Sure, I can demo it now. I thought you were going to ask me how the objects were organized, but...
Oh, yeah. But...
So... Anyway, if we go back to here, Sander, I'll be able to show you that objects tend to be organized by one or more epics, followed by one or more features, and then one or more backlog items. And if we were actually to use the Agile process instead, this would actually be called user stories.
Okay. So how do you propose we use the boards? I mean, if we have just one big list of backlog items, it's going to look pretty cluttered, right?
Oh, you mean, for example, if we have hundreds of backlog items, which I hope nobody does. I hope you keep the backlog fairly lean. Well, I'm glad you asked that, because what we can actually do is start giving backlog items sensible tags that we can filter on.
Okay.
So once we've done this tagging as well, we can find out if a backlog item is ready to go into a sprint by setting a tag for it to be refined. Another option we can do, if I just quickly go back to Azure DevOps, you can also change one of the backlog items to be in the approved state as well. So we have a couple of options there.
So I've seen that we can use various filters on those backlog items. Well, we can't really look at what is ready to go, which is already ready to go into a sprint, right?
I think I see what you mean. If we go back into here, I think I know exactly what you mean. So basically what you're asking about is here on the tags section, you'll notice there's an or and an and option, but what you're saying is you've noticed there's not an not option there.
Yeah.
Bit of a tongue twister for everybody, I know. So yeah, you're quite right. And there are a couple of ways that we can look to overcome this. And the one way which I think is quite useful is to actually create a beautiful query. Now, these aren't called beautiful queries, by the way, it's just a nickname that I've given them. So for example, here, I've got a query that runs that shows a backlog item which doesn't have the refined tag. Now, if I click on editor, you'll see a query designer, which anybody that's worked with Microsoft query designers over the years are probably pretty familiar with. Now, in addition to that, you can also install an extension that's called a WYCL editor. And if you install that extension, you can actually directly edit the code that's used for queries, as you can see here. And again, for those of you who've worked with SQL Server related solutions in the past, This syntax is probably going to be very familiar to you. By the way, Sander, just something else as well relating to your question just now. If we go back into Azure DevOps about that not filter, if we go back here, so basically there was an English guy that actually asked for the not option to be added here, but due to the lack of interest from other people in the community, Microsoft decided not to follow through with it, which I can perfectly understand.
I wonder who that could be.
Big mystery.
So
I'm guessing this is the part where we must set some realistic expectations.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're right there. I mean, for a start, if members of the team are new to Azure DevOps, we're going to have to help them get up to speed. To make sure the team gets as much out of Azure DevOps as possible, I recommend helping colleagues learn more about it. This applies even more if looking to merge development and operation teams, because a lot of the times they would have used different frameworks in their respective teams, for example, Kanban and Scrum. Or an operations team may have only ever used a help desk solution in the past. So it's going to take some effort to do, because you'll probably have to get one team used to the other team's way of working to get them synchronized before you can get them to move the whole team's whole to move further in a DevOps related kind of way.
So on that note, I'm guessing we're still going to use the other application to manage the boards in the meantime, before we get a good look at this.
It depends, to be honest with you. If the company is okay for us to keep using it, that's fine. However, on the other hand, if they decided to go all in with Azure DevOps, we can still use the other application to manage boards for a while whilst we get used to it. However, I recommend ripping that band-aid off as soon as possible and doing the migration pretty sharpish if that's the direction your company's going in. By the way, Sander, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use with Azure Boards?
We only have 45 minutes, Kevin, so we better hurry up.
Good point. Anyway, the main point to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
Okay, now it's time to start talking about Azure Pipelines, which is where we're going to build and deploy our deliverables. Like we said earlier, because this is based on a SQL team, we will cover how it applies to SQL Server. However, a lot of things apply to the whole host of other services, including Kubernetes.
Okay, Sander, I know how this works for various things like websites and Kubernetes, etc., but how exactly would this work for SQL Server?
Well, we could look at using either state-based or migration-based deployments.
Okay, so what's the main difference between those two?
So state-based will use your current Visual Studio project and deploy that state to the target. And it looks for all the changes. So it compares the entire project to the current state of the target and then creates a script and applies that. Whereas with migration-based, you will script out all the changes and apply them incrementally. And migration-based can be good, but if there's a problem, we'd have to redeploy all over again. And for what we intend to do, I think state-based is better for us. By the way, there are lots of articles out there on the internet, state-based versus migration-based deployments, and they give you a lot of information, and it's probably a session on its own with that amount of information.
That's true.
So,
and it's worth.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to throw in as well. In the past, I've used state-based for a very large number of instances as well. So there's pros and cons to both, like Sander said.
So, and it's pretty easy to build a pipeline for SQL Server updates, as I can demonstrate right now. So I'm going to share my screen. If I'm correct, you can see my screen, Kevin.
I can indeed.
So anybody who knows me, I do a lot of stuff with automation, and I am lazy as hell as it comes to repetitive tasks. So when I had to do this for like 30, 35 different databases and create the projects and the solutions and everything, it became tedious very fast. So what I did was I looked for a solution to create some kind of template. And I found that in the PS module development PowerShell module, which is able to create a template for not just single files, but for an entire directory structure as well, with all its files included. And with some tweaking around, I was able to create a template from that. And this is what came out of it. So on my GitHub page, you can actually download this one, and it's called the SSDT with TCLT template. And this is a lot of code, but what it does is it downloads that latest version and then installs it locally on my host. And then in the end, it runs this command, the invoke psmd template. And what this will result in is a look up that folder. For some reason, if you open that project when it's generated, because it generates a solution for you, you actually get two different projects. So one is the data project and one is the tests project. And I want to keep those separate because I don't want my data model to end up with my tests. And I made a reference to inside the test project to actually have this one inside it. So there's a project reference in there, so I don't have to do everything twice. And you can then do something like an import, get all the database objects from your current database, so you will have all the tools available and all the objects in there to start developing using Visual Studio. So that is how you create a project really fast.
Well, that sounds good. From what I can gather, can we use unit tests as well, like we can do for other programming languages? I'm sure you just mentioned it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like you can see right here, I separated the tests from the data model. We can use something like TCLT, and TCLT is a unit testing framework for SQL Server, where you can create tests using the SQL code. So that is a real benefit to database developers, so they don't need to another language like C# or PowerShell to actually create their unit tests. And again, I am lazy as hell when it comes to these kind of things. And I wanted to create tests for the existence of objects. I wanted to know if a table had the correct columns. Does my store procedure have the correct parameters? The same for the views and the constraints, everything in there. And I created a PowerShell module called the PSTCLT test generator. By the way, this is also a PowerShell module, and it's on the PowerShell gallery, so you can just install it from there. And when you run that, you can actually get the tests like this. And one of the tests, for instance, is the database collation. I really want to know if my database collation is correct when I do a deployment. And another one is something if my table exists, so it does an assertion for the object exists. And you can see these are fairly easy tests, and I could easily iterate through it. So what this module does, it takes the current state of your database, generates all those tests for you, and then you can just start doing unit tests for the basic things. Of course, you need some more sophisticated integration testing to actually test the code inside your, for instance, your store procedures. But these will get you along the way and get you started with unit testing. So that is basic unit testing for you.
Well, that's good. So I'm just going to take the screen back a minute, if that's okay, because I just want to show people something here whilst we're talking about pipelines, etc. So if you did happen to use Sander's pipeline, you can actually build on it once it's been completed. So for example, here I've extended Sander's pipeline from the initial build and unit testing stages. I've built on that to deploy to 3 SQL Server 2019 instances, which are actually Docker containers locally on my machine, and now to represent the integration, staging, and production environments you typically use in a deployment pipeline. As you can see here, I've also used it to synchronize the local Git repository to GitHub as well. So if you want to do things in GitHub Actions as well, you can just synchronize your Azure Repos Git repository with a GitHub repository, and you can have that fire off the GitHub action like I was saying. So from there as well, I figured out a way where you can transform the files behind the scenes and then get the project ready to be deployed to either Azure SQL Database or an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I've just shortened it down here. Also, as well, I could quickly show you some YAML behind the scenes just to get everybody used to how YAML looks quickly now before we finish this session. So, for the benefit of time, everybody, this is how YAML looks. You used to have a GUI to do all this in Azure DevOps, and actually pipelines used to actually be called builds at one stage. It's now been called pipelines to reflect the fact that by default you will actually create YAML CI/CD pipelines. You can still go back and use your GUI one if you want by selecting Classic Editor, but YAML is definitely the way forwards. Isn't that right, Sander?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So, like we were saying, you can fire it off the GitHub Actions, and that's all pretty good. And in case anybody was wondering, the reason that we've got this certain pipeline running so fast is because we had something called a runner installed locally, which we are going to cover now. So, like I was saying, Sander, I've seen we can use Microsoft hosted agents even within our own network. And in fact, I've used one as a proof of concept on this laptop, which is a service that Microsoft hosts in Azure to do a lot of processing, build and release tasks, like building artifacts and deploying them. However, it appears that because of our infrastructure, if we wanted to use the external agents, we'd have a lot of issues internally. For example, we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests so the agents in Azure can communicate through to our own servers. So we are better off building our own agents internally, I think.
Oh, maybe, but remember, a lot of us are developers and we don't want to build our own servers. Plus, we'd have to figure out what software we need to install and on those agents and maintain them, right? Or do you have another solution for that?
Well, actually, if you look, if I scroll down here, you'll see that Microsoft actually provides you guides on how to create these agents. It just happens to have a bit of a confusing name for the repo now because they've actually upgraded the repository in GitHub to reflect the fact that you can also use the same images for the GitHub action runners.
Nice. So, well, if we're going to do that, we might as well run the agent through the command line instead of using it as a service.
How come?
Well, everybody knows that when you run something through the command line, you get more detailed results, right? Well,
I tested this a while ago. So shall we see the results in the next slide?
Yeah, behold.
Ta-da!
Well, there's not much there, Kevin. Well, next part, test plans.
Okay, you seem to have moved on from that one fairly quickly after that.
Yeah, I need some more information than that. So, of course, we can do something like test plans once we've done the initial build and release before we release something else elsewhere.
That's true. Even though I did thought that they all had to be automated, and that would actually take some effort.
Well, not necessarily. Your test plans can have manual steps as well, which you can test right now.
Okay, well, since you asked so nicely, I will go in and have a test. So let's have a look at a test plan. So I click on here. Ah, yeah. So if I go to execute, I'm guessing to actually execute the test plan and select it. I'll click on run for web applications, see what happens. Oh, it's nice. Oh, yeah. So basically, as you can see here, you can have various steps in your test plan and just tick if they passed or failed. And you can put pictures in as well of pipelines, for example. If you click on one that's failed, you can also create a bug based on it. You can do various other things here, I've noticed. You can capture a screenshot. We can record the entire session. And I do believe, yeah, we can record the screen with audio. So you can actually talk whilst you're doing it.
Nice.
So yeah, that looks quite good. For the benefit of time, I won't go through everything else.
Yeah, we'd better discuss artifacts here because we're running short on time. And this is where we will share some various things like NuGet packages with other people. For example, if you create a NuGet package, you can share it within Azure Artifacts for others to use.
That's true. And also as well, you can actually use it as a cache from popular packages that you download online. So from the organization can just use this feed instead, like the one I've got here, for example. By the way, on a kind of unrelated note, just a reminder that you can actually create your own Visual Studio subscription organization, I should say, based on your Visual Studio subscription.
Yeah, this is just in case that you want to test things out without the fear of breaking your company's Azure DevOps organization. So.
Yeah, and it's very easy to create your organization. I will just quickly show you now before we finish the session. So you can just go here, click on the organization. Once you've got your Azure DevOps account set up, and then you can create X amount of organizations for use. Yep. So there are other features I'm looking forward to the team using, Sander. However, I am realizing that we've got a couple of minutes left. So I just quickly run for a couple now. If I go back into the project, for example, really looking forward to using the dashboard functionality. And can view these during the daily stand-ups.
Don't forget the wiki.
Well, that's true. And then there's the new analytics views feature as well, which is still in preview. And it's basically really useful. You can promote all of these data sets to be used within Power BI for use. Oh. There's also an Azure DevOps extension for CLI we can use if you want to use it as a portal.
Okay. So, good idea. We should get everybody on board if you want to get Azure DevOps fully implemented. Anyway, that's all we've got time for today, folks. And I'm wondering if there are any questions.
And whilst we're waiting for questions, thank you everybody for watching today's session.
Thank you.